with the changing of generations and changing of technology, it will eventually be that everything's electronic and there are no print newspapers. Do you think that's on the way?
I think the one thing that's certain is that when you listen to people forecasting what's going to happen in the future, they're almost always going to be wrong. I don't know anybody who's forecasted correctly trends for the future. In terms of print, right now, it looks as if print is waning in popularity, but you can never tell whether or not that's a permanent position or whether something will happen to make print trendy or whether, look at the story of vinyl, which was discarded completely because CDs were going to be the way forward, and then CDs were discarded for digital downloads. Now vinyl is regarded as the best way by many people to listen to music and is having a comeback to such an extent that they're selling vinyl records in Sainsbury's. So I don't think you can ever be entirely sure of what's going to happen next. Personally, I think there is something about print which is a very strong and dramatic way to communicate the news to readers. I don't think it will ever have the circulations that we saw at the peak of print, but I personally don't think it will ever get to a stage where there will be no newspapers. That might be wishful thinking, but I think it's such a good way to deliver content to readers that I think there will always be an audience for that. But clearly that audience will be smaller because there'll be a big audience for digital platforms too.
Can I just interject one thing about the vinyl? It never went away for everyone. There were lots of people that kept the faith. And one of my best friends has got one of the best music shops in Glasgow. And they
Yeah,
always did vinyl. And there's collectors come in and out. And
totally.
he's that shop for 20 years. So,
Well, absolutely. And newspapers haven't gone away either, by the way. Look at thousands of copies of newspapers are sold every day. Not as many thousands as were sold, but if you were launching a newspaper today and it had sales figures equivalent to that of the Daily Mirror or the Daily Record or the Sun, you'd be pretty happy with that because those figures are good figures. They're not good enough to compare with how they were, maybe 20, 30 years ago. But, if they were startups, they would be pretty happy.
yeah. Just to move it on a little bit, why is
Yeah,
it that you think that in Scotland only one of the newspapers supports independence, or one of the dailies and one of the
yeah,
Sundays? I mean, like, there is this idea, yes, it was a business decision taken. I understand that.
yeah.
A company wants to have the opportunity to make money from two different sides of an argument. But that's only still one or one on a Sunday out of, what is it, 37? Why
Yeah,
is the media generally so hostile to Scottish independence?
I've asked myself that question many, many times. And I have not come up with an answer that really makes much sense. I think there's two parts to that question, and I'd quite like to talk first of all about an assumption that you made there that the decision to make the Sunday Herald an independent sporting newspaper, and I suppose also the decision then to launch the National, the assumption that that decision was a purely a business decision, which isn't actually the case. The Sunday Herald, not everybody in the Sunday Herald, but many people in the Sunday Herald who worked for the Sunday Herald had grown to a position of being supportive of independence. And we believed that it would be better if the newspaper was honest about its intentions by that stage. And those intentions were to be campaigning for an independent Scotland. Now, that was a decision taken by the editor at the time, who was me. We didn't have a vote on it in the staff, but it wasn't imposed on me by my management, who said, you know what, there's a real business opportunity here. We don't have a newspaper that supports independence. We need one to make some money. So Sunday Herald is going to be it. That wasn't the way it happened at all. The decision was mine to take. Yes, I discussed it with the proprietor. He had some reservations about, would it drive advertisers away? Would it impact badly in sales? Reservations which were quite right to have, because if we had taken that decision and we had lost advertisers and lost readers and therefore we were no longer sustainable, then that would have been a bad decision, granted. But we were pretty certain when we eventually went ahead that that would not be the case. And indeed, we were proved to be correct in that. So it was a decision which came from a passionate belief in independence, but which was calculated in a way to, insofar as we wanted to make sure we wouldn't be put out of business because of it. So that's what happened. The same with the National. The National was launched because the response to the Sunday Herald had been so good. Many people who were reading the Sunday Herald wanted a daily newspaper to support independence, and so we provided that to them. Now, that seems to me to be the right way for newspapers to work. I think a newspaper should be governed by its editor, in that its editor should decide its political stance, and they should be able to do that. I would not be happy to work in an organisation where the management decided a political stance and handed it down to the editor.
But I think, sorry, just to
Yeah.
interrupt, but I think it is quite obvious that many media organisations do work like that. I mean, you just have to have a look at, say, Fox News.
Yeah. Many media organisations do work like that. But in this case, that wasn't how it worked. In this case, it was my decision as editor to move the Sunday Herald to an independent supporting position. It was my decision as an editor that the National would be a good thing to do, and it was my decision on how to do it and how to shape it and how that paper should look and how it should perform. So I'm quite happy to stand by those decisions because I think they proved to be the right decisions at the time. But the people who criticise NewsQuest, I suppose it would be people who criticise NewsQuest for backing both horses at the same time by having pro-indie papers and non-indie supporting newspapers, that's just a consequence of having different editors. The only way to have a company such as the Herald and Times in unanimity about the political stance is for the management to impose that stance on the different editors. That doesn't happen, nor should it happen. So the fact that you've got a number of newspapers that take different stances, in my eyes, is a good thing, and therefore I don't think the criticism of it really stands up to much scrutiny. So basically what I'm saying is that it wasn't just a business decision. It came from a passionate belief in something, and that's the way things should operate.
The other part of the question was that why, when you consider you've got a population now, according to the polls, that's very 50-50, why have no other newspapers decided to make that decision?
Well, I must admit not to understand that. I suppose they would be, maybe they're looking at the position of the National and saying, right, okay, maybe that doesn't bring in enough advertising for our purposes. So therefore, that's maybe not a wise business decision to move from where we are to an independent supporting newspaper. Could be that because the National isn't awash with advertising currently. Sales figures are good and its advertising brings in enough, but it could have more advertising in it. I think that's simply because there are so few independent supporting newspapers, advertisers are probably a little bit wary of joining in with it until they see how that would work and how its relationship with its readers develop and how they could get their message over to the readers of the National. They're maybe slightly worried about how that works because it's not a traditional newspaper and therefore it will take some time to bed in, which I guess is understandable in some ways. But I do think that for me, an independent Scotland would be a good thing for the Scottish media. Scottish media doesn't seem at this stage to agree with that. I'm not quite sure the evidence they have to make them reluctant to support independence. I do think is there a groupthink in the media to an extent where certain things become a line or become the thing that people support because of so many people do it, so many people support that line, so many people think a certain way, so it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like, that people who don't support independence, they won't do it, they won't change their minds because only one newspaper does it and it's maybe a wee bit lonely in there. I don't really know. It's a bit baffling to me. I think certainly if you look at the criticism, even from journalists of the National and the Sunday Herald being called McPravda and all this nonsense about that we're unable to report the truth or the facts of the matter because we have to support independence, but yet if you're against independence, clearly it's perfectly reasonable to trust these newspapers to tell the truth. I don't really understand the distinction they make. I don't understand why that's quite a widely held view that of all newspapers, we are uniquely compromised. I don't really see how they can make that argument, but yet it seems to be quite a widely held belief.
Are you sure it's a belief or it's just a form of campaigning?
I think it's partly a form of campaigning. I think it is partly a belief. I do think that. I suppose independence is one of those subjects that is clearly it's a binary choice. You're either for it or you're against it, and therefore it's not like you're supporting Labour or the Conservatives or whatever. So, if you are for independence, we have on our masthead, the National has on its masthead the newspaper that supports an independent Scotland, and it should have that on its masthead because it should be honest with its readers and tell readers what it supports and where it stands on that issue. And that's the issue that brought that newspaper into being. So it's having that in its masthead is a proud statement. But the Daily Mail, for instance, doesn't have in its masthead the newspaper that stands against Scotland being an independent country. It clearly does do that, but it doesn't proclaim it to be so. So maybe there's an issue about, because we're very obvious and very honest and upfront about what we believe in, they say that maybe they think genuinely. I think some people do genuinely think that makes it very difficult for us, for instance, to run stories which are critical of the SNP. I think we have run stories that are critical of the SNP, but we don't run stories that are critical of the SNP just per se. The SNP is bad, whatever it does. I think that's just not true, and I don't think it does your readers any favour. When the Forth Bridge closed, and some people tried to make that closure the fault of the SNP. I mean, it was clearly nonsense. I don't understand why a newspaper should just, on a point of principle, blame everything on the government of the day just because it's the government of the day. There are clearly some things. We had issues with the way Police Scotland behaved, for instance, in the new single force. Absolutely, and I think we covered those. And in the Sunday Herald, we covered them even more extensively, and I think that we were right to do so. But that doesn't mean to say that every single thing the SNP does is bad. I think you have an issue with that the press regards itself, quite rightly, as one of the pillars of the establishment, I guess, that holds the government of the day to account. And therefore, maybe it believes that every single thing that government does is bad and therefore needs to be written in that way. I think that some things the government of the day will do will be bad and will absolutely merit criticism, and some of the things will not necessarily be its fault, and some of its policies may not, surprise, be bad at all, but may be good.
But also you find that a lot of the individual journalists and newspapers, when the government changes, they often turn from vicious watchdogs to lapdogs.
I think they would deny that. I think they would say that they bring the same amount of scrutiny to bear, and they brought the same amount of scrutiny to bear on the Labour Party as they now do on the SNP.
I think that's debatable, though.
Well, it's absolutely debatable, but I think you would need to find absolute examples of that happening. Because I remember, I mean, I'm not making excuses for journalists. That is debatable, and there are issues with how they report the SNP as being wrong on every single occasion, absolutely. But I think it would be wrong to suggest that journalists, when the Labour Party were in power, that journalists gave Labour an easy time of it or did not criticise the Labour Party in just as vicious language as it did the SNP, because I remember that they did sometimes.
But sometimes, yeah. No,
I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying there is no issue there. I think there is an issue, but I don't think it's as clear cut as some people suggest. And I think the Labour Party, when it was in power, certainly had its critics within the Scottish press. Absolutely, the Sunday Herald was one of them, and there were other newspapers as well. We need to remember as well that there was a long time in Scotland when the Labour Party was just omnipotent, and it had tentacles in every single part of the Scottish establishment, and that takes a long time to work its way out the system. And I don't think even though the SNP has been in power for quite a while now, then I don't think we've had long enough for the Labour Party's tentacles, if you like, just to slip out of some of the places that it reached.
Do you think that includes BBC Scotland or Reporting Scotland and BBC News output in Scotland? Because, the allegation, and, there's been sort of family links and business links and stuff. The allegation's been there for a long time that Scottish Labour Party and BBC Scotland, Current Affairs Department are hand in hand.
There are individual journalists who will have links to the Labour Party, absolutely. And if not now, certainly in the future, there will be individual journalists